So this should work. He's hooked up already. Is it turned on? You should mute your computer.
I should mute my computer exactly right.
Didn't work. He's not turning.
Should I use this or this?
You can use this. Then you are all set up, and then you can use the other thing where
Okay.
all the audiences.
Okay. Is this on?
This is not on now.
Okay. Do you need to switch it on? Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
Maybe online. I don't know. But anyway, if anybody wants.
I think mine is also off.
Is yours on?
Yeah, you're on. That one's
You
on.
need to talk to anybody needs to talk. You have to remember.
But I don't know if you are you hooked on up there? Okay.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Okay. So that's that one. Okay, I think, are we set technically?
Klaus, if you could make Anton and Anne and me all into co-hosts. Now I'm audible? Okay,
I
excellent.
don't really need to be. I'm just looking at television screens. Okay, can I declare this meeting open? Well, welcome everybody, both all of you here in the hall and all of you people out there logged in to us. We have a session on intentional communities and COVID, part 2. So I am chairing the session, and Dan is going to talk about Camphill and COVID. And Dan and I go back quite a long way. We met on a wall at Amana
Yes, we did.
quite a few years ago, maybe in 2004 or something. And
Must be a multiple of 3 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah,
And 4
yeah.
would be it. Yeah.
right. And we've been corresponding and become friends over the years. And is this the second conference that we're doing together?
I suppose so. Yeah. Makes
Right.
sense.
Good.
You know, when we met at that wall in Amana, I think you and I were the first 2 people ever to do a Camphill related presentation at an ICSA meeting.
That's possibly true. Yeah.
That was
Yeah, in
the
fact,
beginning
it
of
is
ICSA and
absolutely true.
Camphill.
Yeah, that's right. And now we are in an auditorium, which is not in the Camphill, but it could well be. So that's really great. So I'm really happy to chair this meeting, and I give the word over to you. I expect that because there's only one speaker, we will have a presentation and then a round of questions and discussion afterwards.
Well, a little bit more, actually. What I think we're going to do, since the person who was going to be my co-presenter in this session wound up presenting in COVID-1 yesterday, is after I finish and after you've had a chance to ask me questions, we will kind of do an open mic if anyone wants to share additional reflections on what COVID has meant for the communities where you live or the communities that you study. Or for the historians, perhaps reflections on what other epidemics may have meant communally. We are recording, good. So I'm delighted to share some information and reflections about the Camphill movements experienced during the pandemic. This information comes from a survey that I and a few collaborators conducted during the spring of 2022. This research was sponsored by the Camphill Foundation, a funding body for Camphill in North America and worldwide, and the Camphill Academy, which is an educational program that enables Camphill volunteers to earn academic degrees while living at Camphill. Together, Camphill Foundation and Camphill Academy sponsor an annual Camphill Research Symposium, and this research project grew out of last year's symposium. Before I share the survey results, let me tell you about Camphill. And I know this is familiar for most of you, but not all. So I'll get us all on the same page. Camphill's 120 intentional communities are spread across 5 continents, though most are in the British Isles, Northern Europe, and North America. In every Camphill place, people with and without intellectual disabilities share daily life and work, often in rural settings where agriculture and various crafts predominate among the work opportunities. The oldest Camphill communities are schools that support children with disabilities, but the most common Camphill type is the village that supports adults with disabilities in a rural setting that is somewhat set apart from its surroundings. There are also training colleges that help young adults with disabilities find their lives' work, town communities that are fully integrated into ordinary neighborhoods, and elder communities that care for older adults, both with and without disabilities. The movement originated in 1939 on an estate called Camphill that is located just west of Aberdeen, Scotland. Camphill's founders were a group of mostly Jewish refugees from Nazi-occupied Vienna. They were all students of Rudolf Steiner's spiritual tradition known as anthroposophy, and their ideas about how to support people with disabilities came from Steiner's lectures on what he called curative education. In the early years of the movement, all Camphill communities practiced both life sharing and income sharing. That meant that people of diverse abilities lived in common households, eating the same meals, using the same kitchens and bathrooms, working side by side, socializing and vacationing together. No one received direct financial compensation for their labor, instead relying on the community to provide for their individual needs. Over 83 years, these defining practices have evolved. Some communities no longer practice either income sharing or life sharing. They remain intentional communities insofar as the people with disabilities continue to live cooperatively with a sense of shared purpose. Other Camphills practice income sharing and life sharing in new, modified ways. No Camphill places have retained the practices in their pristine form. Now you'll need to give me just a moment while I start to share my slides. Okay, the part where my screen where
Slideshow, maybe?
yeah, that's what I'm looking for, but yeah, but it's covered up and I can't. Yeah. See, this is in my way. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, our survey was completed by 41 communities, or about 1/3 of all Camphill places. 35 of the participating communities are located in just 4 of Camphill's 8 regions: Northern Europe, North America, Scotland, and Central Europe. The first 3 of those regions represent, in the aggregate, the wing of Camphill that is more traditional in its practice of income sharing and life sharing. By contrast, the Irish and English regions have moved furthest away from traditional practices. We received only 1 survey from each of those regions, and those surveys came from communities that were not typical of their regions. So it's fair to say that the results that I'm going to present are skewed toward the more traditional, more communal wing of Camphill, though again, even that wing has made significant changes to traditional practices. Among the participating communities, half indicated that they have fewer than 50 residents, and just 5 reported more than 100 residents. We can extrapolate that our data reflects the experiences of more than 2,000 Camphill residents. We also asked about how many total people are present in each community during a typical week, so also including people who participate in day programs or are employed. These responses suggest a more inclusive total of somewhat more than 3,000 Camphillers whose experiences will be represented today. The participating communities reflect the mix of Camphill types. 55% identified as villages or town communities that mostly serve adults over age 25. 2 identified as schools for children and 3 as elder communities. Only 2 identified exclusively as training colleges for young adults, but it's likely that of the 9 communities that serve a mix of ages, several are training colleges that are gradually evolving into villages because some of the young adults who come there as young adults wind up staying long-term. And some may be communities like Vincent's that truly are serving all ages, children and adults. So what has the pandemic been like for these communities? I'll start with the good news. Camphill communities largely held the virus at bay during the early years of the pandemic, when fatalities were at their highest level. Fully half of the participating communities indicated that they remained virus-free until the beginning of 2022, and another quarter indicated that their first cases appeared in the second half of 2021 after vaccines were widely available. During the Omicron surge of spring 2022, many Camphill communities experienced outbreaks, and as a result, most of our respondents indicated that their communities had had at least 20 positive COVID tests. These numbers would be significantly higher if people had filled out the survey in May rather than, as was often the case, in March. By the time these outbreaks occurred, widespread vaccination largely insulated Camphill from the most severe consequences of infection. Thus, only 3 participating communities indicated that they had had residents hospitalized, and only 1 indicated the death of a resident. Likewise, 5 communities reported the hospitalization of non-residential community members, and 1 reported the death of a non-residential community member. The structure of the survey introduces a bit of ambiguity here, since the 2 communities that reported deaths each checked the box for 1 to 3 deaths. I suspect that in each case, we're dealing with a single person who died of COVID, but it could be as many as 3. Thus, the overall death rate for Camphill residents is probably 1 in 2,000, but could be as high as 1 in 700. The overall death rate for all Camphillers, residential, non-residential, is probably 1 in 1,500, but could be as high as 1 in 500. We can compare this with the overall death rates in the 3 nations best represented in our survey. In the United States, that rate is 1 in 300, in the UK, 1 in 400, in Norway, 1 in 2,000. So in other words, Camphill COVID mortality has been broadly similar to COVID mortality in Norway. We also asked our respondents about the extent to which members of their community experienced increased anxiety and depression during the pandemic. The responses would be more meaningful if we also had data from a control group of non-Camphill organizations. To my eye, it seems favorable that only 7 responding communities indicated that more than half of their members experienced increased anxiety, and only 1 indicated that more than half had experienced increased depression. If I'd been asked the same question with regard to Harvard Divinity School, where I work, I would have answered that the overwhelming majority of us experienced increased anxiety, and quite a few experienced increased depression as well. But that may just be the bias of how I would interpret the question. That said, the responses to our open-ended question about the most significant negative health effects of COVID made it crystal clear that Camphillers regarded the mental health consequences of COVID as much more significant for them than the direct effects of infection. The data I have been sharing is open to a range of interpretations. My own view is that on balance, Camphill fared better during the pandemic than did the larger society, at least in the United States and United Kingdom. This outcome may be unsurprising to many of us at this conference, since we are predisposed to think that intentional communities offer a superior alternative to mainstream society. But there are at least two ways in which Camphill's COVID success might be considered surprising. First, Camphill communities are, by some definitions, congregate care facilities in which medically vulnerable people live in densely populated settings. Especially in the early days of the pandemic, deaths were concentrated in such facilities, albeit more in nursing homes and prisons than in residential care facilities for people with intellectual disabilities. The fact that no Camphill community in this survey experienced a deadly outbreak during the first phase of the pandemic lends some credence to the Camphill assertion that intentional communities are not institutions and do not carry the same risks associated with institutions. But the sample size here is too small for me, at least, to make this interpretation too emphatically. A second reason that Camphill's success might be considered surprising is that Camphill is inspired by anthroposophy. The anthroposophical movement has historically been characterized by skepticism about mainstream medical practices in general and about vaccines in particular. Now, this is a very complex issue, and I have neither the time nor the expertise to unfold its full complexity. So I'll just make a few quick observations. First, there's a distinct tradition of anthroposophical medicine, which can broadly be described as integrative. Practitioners offer homeopathic, herbal, and other alternative therapies, but also receive conventional medical training and certification. Compared to mainstream practice, anthroposophical medicine puts more emphasis on promoting overall health and less emphasis on conquering disease. Second, anthroposophical medicine has generally avoided taking firm positions for or against vaccines, stressing instead the right of each person to make individual choices that are attentive to personal circumstances and informed by both scientific and spiritual insights. A wide variety of views on vaccination are prominent and respected within anthroposophical circles. Third, anthroposophists have often been most skeptical of mandatory vaccination against childhood diseases. Some anthroposophists believe that such diseases actually contribute to long-term health. Many anthroposophical critics of mandatory childhood vaccination have spoken more favorably about COVID-19 vaccination, especially when targeted to those who are most at risk of serious illness. During the pandemic, official anthroposophical statements about vaccination have generally turned more positive than they were pre-pandemic. In contrast with other circles of people, notably the Republican Party in the United States, that were not anti-vaccine prior to the pandemic, but have aggressively resisted mandating the COVID vaccine. The leaders of anthroposophical medicine have worked hard, though not with perfect success, to promote dialogue and prevent polarization around COVID vaccination within the movement. Fourth and finally, anthroposophical attitudes toward vaccination should not be conflated with Camphill attitudes toward vaccination, since only a relatively small proportion of Camphillers are themselves committed practitioners of anthroposophy. Okay, so to illumine the reasons for Camphill's relative success in managing the pandemic, I'll now turn to the portion of our survey where we asked communities to describe the particular practices they adopted in response. The first question had to do with who made decisions about each community's response to the pandemic. Fully 75% of the communities indicated that most COVID-related decisions were made by a central leader or leadership team. A subsequent open-ended question clarified that in virtually all cases, this was in fact a team and not an individual. And that's kind of what you see on the screen right now. Just 7 communities indicated that decisions were made by, quote, a variety of individuals and groups, and only 3 said that they were made by the entire community. Now that surprised me. It has generally been my impression, which I have sometimes expressed in print, that Camphill decision-making is ordinarily by a variety of individuals and groups. Most Camphill communities have multiple decision-making committees with diverse task areas. Camphillers often find it easier to trust decisions when power is diffused. At the same time, however, Camphill communities are accountable to the social care authorities that fund them. Those authorities prefer transparent and centralized authority structures. To varying degrees, Camphill places have accommodated to this external pressure by appointing executive directors or leadership teams. Often, these central leaders make decisions that are of interest to external authorities, while decisions that relate only to the internal life of the community are made in the traditional, more collaborative way. The survey responses thus imply that Camphillers understood themselves to be accountable to external authorities in shaping their pandemic responses. They did not feel entirely free to make decisions in accordance with the shared wisdom of the community. That's not to say that external authority and internal wisdom necessarily contradicted, but it's noteworthy that while 82% of communities said they, quote, implemented policies that were mandated by our public health authorities, only 60% said they, quote, implemented policies that were proposed by members of our community. Oh, I shouldn't have switched ahead quite yet. We also included an open-ended question that allowed communities to describe their decision-making in greater detail. These responses confirmed that in responding to COVID, Camphill followed the pattern of deference to external authority that they had developed in response to social care authorities and funding bodies. In this regard, Camphill's COVID response may have been different from that of other intentional communities with less accountability to external authority. We also included a question about the extent to which COVID responses created conflict in the communities. Only 20% of responding communities replied that they had experienced significant disagreements among ourselves about how to respond to COVID. And only 2 communities reported significant disagreements with social care or public health authorities. By contrast, fully 2/3 of respondents said they were successful in resolving our disagreements. Just 5 communities reported ongoing conflict, and just 1 indicated that they had lost members as a result. These responses diverge a bit from the perception on the part of some international Camphill leaders that there has in fact been widespread conflict. I can see 3 possible explanations for this. First, one of the communities that reported conflict, and indeed submitted 2 rival sets of responses to our survey, is an especially large and influential community. Second, it's possible that some communities failed to respond to the survey because they could not agree on how to do so. And third, this is what I think is the real answer, it may be that the most serious conflicts exist not within particular Camphill communities, but within the so-called inner community of coworkers from around the world who've made a lifelong spiritual commitment to Camphill. The inner community includes quite a few people who no longer live in Camphill because they believe the movement has been too deferential to external authority, especially when it comes to life sharing and income sharing. It stands to reason that these individuals might object to the choice of most Camphill places to be extremely accommodating to public health authorities in their COVID responses. We also asked detailed questions about Camphill practices with regard to masking, testing, vaccination, and social distancing. We asked not only whether Camphill places use these practices, but how long they were in effect and in what contexts. The result was a large accumulation of data that is not necessarily subject to clear interpretation. Be careful how many questions you put in your survey. My summary of this information will thus be subject to revision. In certain respects, Camphill's response to COVID was similar to that of other residential organizations and consistent with public health guidance. Camphill Places made widespread, extended use of vaccination, masking, and testing to limit the spread of COVID and reduce the severity of disease for those who became infected. As you can see in the slide that I finally caught up to, a clear majority of Camphill Places reported that at least 90% of their residential members were vaccinated for COVID, and more than another quarter indicated that between 75 and 89% were vaccinated. These high vaccination rates were achieved in part because Camphillers believed they had no choice but to comply with public health mandates, but also in part through the free choices of individual Camphillers. 75% of responding communities said that they encourage but do not require community members to be vaccinated, compared to 20% who said they have a vaccine mandate with some exceptions, and just 10% who said they had an absolute mandate. Camphill's mandate masking most extensively when Camphillers interact with people from beyond their communities. Oh, okay, I didn't mean to go here yet. Ignore this slide until I get to it. So 28 responding communities, so the majority, said they had policies for masking in effect for more than 6 months that required community members to wear masks when away from the community. 24 said they had mask mandates for visitors for at least 6 months, and 16 had mask mandates for recently arrived community members for at least 6 months. By contrast, many communities were reluctant to require masking when community members interacted with one another. Though 10 required this for more than 6 months, 14 never required it at all. 13 mandated masking within workshops for more than 6 months, and 6 never required it. Likewise, Camphill practices of testing were directed primarily toward visitors as well as toward symptomatic residents. 23 communities indicated that they had testing requirements for symptomatic residents in place for at least 6 months, and 15 communities had such policies in place for visitors for at least 6 months. But only 5 communities had testing requirements in place for all residents for at least 6 months, and 18 communities said they never had such policies. And for me, I'm comparing this with being at a university where we had a regular testing mandate from the availability of testing right up to about a month ago. So Camphill seems a little bit low testing from where I sit. Compared with the practice in other organizations, Camphill's made frequent changes to their social distancing policies in response to changing levels of infection and the availability of vaccines. The most enduring strategies were to move indoor activities outdoors and in-person activities online. 19 of the responding communities said they did each of these things for at least 6 months, and only 2 and 4 communities, respectively, said they never did these things. The comments, however, suggested that it was much more common to move indoor activities outdoors than to move in-person activities online. Generally, the things that moved online were meetings that involved only non-disabled coworkers and employees. Most communities imposed some restrictions on interaction between residents of different houses and on the ability of residents to leave the community, but very few kept those in place for more than 6 months. Non-residential community members experienced more restrictions. 9 communities said they asked for those folks to stay away for at least 6 months, and another 11 communities asked them to stay away for 1 to 2 months. Restrictions on visitors to Camphill were widespread and quite enduring. Not all Camphills have businesses that serve the general public, but those that do mostly shut them down, often for more than 6 months. 12 communities said they asked their neighbors to stay away for at least 6 months, and another 12 for 1 to 6 months. Even the friends and family of residents were restricted. At 5 communities, they were asked to stay away for at least 6 months, and at 16 more communities for 1 to 6 months. These policies were quite challenging, especially for people with intellectual disabilities who may not have fully understood why they suddenly weren't getting visited by their families. But they were also effective in the sense that the loosening of such policies in 2022 coincided with a significant increase in COVID cases, fortunately at a moment when the disease was not especially lethal. As I explore the data on Camphill's practice of social distancing, I notice what I think is a pretty sharp divergence from the practice at the residential organizations I know best, namely colleges and universities. At least in the United States, colleges and universities relied heavily on the dispersal of residential communities, asking students and faculty to stay away from campus, and on online technologies to conduct our ordinary business virtually. Camphill did very little dispersal of residential communities and far less online activity than colleges and universities. They relied on moving activities outdoors and on drawing sharper boundaries between each community and its neighbors. This is where I get emotional, sorry. While many college students experienced extreme physical isolation for periods of more than a year, Camphillers treated their large households, and in many cases entire communities, as pods, allowing relatively normal social interaction within circles of 10 to 100 people. The more I reflect on the Camphill data, the more grief I feel for my students and for university students in general. For the entire period before vaccines became available, and often for as much as a year after, many universities assumed that dispersal was the only strategy that would keep residential communities safe, and they absolved themselves of any responsibility for the mental health consequences of the resulting isolation. Camphill's experience suggests that they could have made very different choices without negative physical health effects. Of course, Camphill's strategy of raising its boundaries with the outside world was not without costs. In many ways, Camphill reverted to habits of limited interaction with the outside that had been more common in the movement 2 generations ago. Most Camphillers today believe such older practices undermine Camphill's mission to be a seed of social renewal, and they've worked hard to build bridges with their neighbors. During the pandemic, those bridges fell into disrepair, even as internal relationships were often strengthened. So now I finally get to the slide that's you've been watching all this time. One of the final questions on our survey had to do with the anticipated long-term consequences of the pandemic. We asked about 12 possible consequences, 6 of them positive and 6 negative, and received fairly equivocal responses to most pairings. 7 communities expected to emerge with more members, 6 with fewer, leaving almost 2/3 anticipating no change. Only 1 community expected to be in better physical health, but only 5 expected to be in worse. 6 expected to be in better shape financially, 4 in worse. Not surprisingly, the question about mental health generated a stronger response. 15 communities expected to be in worse mental and social health, compared to only 4 that expected to be in better. But the responses were even more dramatic to the 4 questions we asked about connectedness. 14 communities expected to be less connected to their neighbors, compared to only 1 that expected to be more connected. At the same time, 19 communities said they would emerge more connected to one another. That was the only outcome response that was chosen by a majority of communities, though on the other side, 9 said they would emerge less connected to one another. What these responses suggest to me is that for Camphill, COVID was not primarily a medical or public health phenomenon, but instead a social phenomenon. From the perspective of developmental communalism, the pandemic slowed or even reversed a long-standing trend toward lower boundaries and increasing integration with the larger society. Camphillers experienced a fresh taste of the intimacy and intensity of a newly founded intentional community in which people relied deeply on one another for their physical and emotional needs. At the same time, They experienced a wrenching disruption of neighborly relationships that many had come to see as essential for the overall well-being of their communities. In the years ahead, it will be interesting to see if they are able to retain some of the intimacy while rebuilding the neighborliness. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. That was interesting to see how communities differ from the wider society in many different ways, and also are similar in other ways. I think what we're going to do now is have first a session of a sort of questions and comments, and then if we feel that it's correct, we can have an open mic to hear other responses, what your responses were, and also the people out there. I'm assuming you will tell me if there are any questions. Let's start with a question from the people here. And Vincent, can you hand that to anybody? Does this check if it works? It's not good for me to check it because I'm already on. Is there anybody here who would like to make a comment or ask a question about the presentation we just heard? Yeah, that's why you're here.
All that COVID isolation.
Be able to look.
Now we can hear.
So my question is on one, I just really appreciate the findings, and I feel even more that would be good to get this out to the wider world. You know, and because both because of what you talked about with colleges. You said earlier something about, well, certainly Camphill communities don't think of themselves as institutions. I have an interest in the institutionalization of the values and the models. So I don't see institutionalization as a bad thing, but I understand what they're saying. So, so I'm not sure it's a question, but it's just an observation of an opportunity. I've found through Grey Panthers, which I've been active with online for a number of years now, that the nursing home crisis in the US and the 40% of people who died early on who were older adults and people with disabilities, the nursing home industry, the institutionalized profit making and the business models, I mean, we're like very clear that that is what killed people, that these were already institutions. They were institutions even if they were privately owned by different entities, but the things that made them dangerous and killed their residents were actually already known before COVID.
Yeah.
So it's and the evidence is just overwhelmingly coming up that it was about being poor in a Medicaid nursing home or a long-term care. So this is relevant even, I think, to that you can hold high standards and values and not kill your members. So I just want to encourage that there's a dialogue here with the larger public policy. And I maybe it will even strengthen Camphill's efforts to be seen you know, as a successful social intervention model or assistance model. I don't have all the language, but thank you. And
yeah, a word I should have used a little bit more in the presentation. Oh,
it's okay.
yeah, is austerity and the challenges of any sort of caring community in a larger society where neoliberal values, you know, undermine any activities that don't make a profit.
Close to home and intimate is how does any organization operate? So yeah, but austerity, that's a very general, I get what you're saying about public policy, but I think this is This is more about really a subtle knowledge that who owns and how it's governed makes a
Yeah.
huge difference in outcomes. And I feel that brings us closer to the intentional community
Yeah.
model. Thanks.
Okay.
Well, that too, and in this case, they're not paid a lot.
Okay,
So, but yeah.
we have a question from the,
Oh, I wanted to respond to one
okay.
more part of Betsy's comment, which was at the beginning about the word institution. And because I do want to disambiguate two different ways the word can be used. When you said it has a positive meaning, I think what you were getting at is that the work of finding ways to make life-giving patterns of interaction endure can be described as an institutionalization of those life-giving practices, making an institution, making it established. And especially in the world of eco-villages and co-housing, it's very important to talk about how do we institutionalize our experiments? How do we, if we figure out something good, let's make it last beyond just us. In the world, in the world of disability and social care, the word institution is irremediably tainted because it's associated with large facilities that warehouse people in fundamentally dehumanizing ways. So Camphill would have to find a different word to describe what the positive sense of institution that you're alluding to.
okay, let's go online, and we have a question from
Libby, right?
it sounds like, it looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So I'm wondering on this really big split between, around connectedness with neighbors. Whether that, I'm not sure whether in the ultimate survey design there were any explanatory sort of options there, because when I think about that question and thinking about who might be answering the question, on behalf of the community, I wonder whether neighbors includes commuting community members, because that would be a really, the idea that commuters, I think for, a school, paraprofessionals, for example, the idea that paraprofessionals came out of this more connected with the community, that would be surprising, I think. So could it be, you talked about this as maybe slowing or even reversing a bit that developmental communalism process towards more porous boundaries with the society. It seems like commuters maybe might have fallen in the gap there, and I wonder on which side.
Yeah. Well, as you probably realize, Libby, you have tapped into one of my hobby horses, which is, who do Camphillers think they're talking about when they say Camphillers? Because sometimes, and this is the usage of the Camphill inner community that I alluded to, Camphiller may mean only non-disabled adults who've made a long-term commitment to the inner values of Camphill. At the other end, the usage I would hope to promote would be that Camphiller includes anybody who spends a significant part of each week at a Camphill place, whether as a student, a teacher, a residential person with or without disabilities, a person who participates in a day program, an employee who comes during the workday, even board members or extended family members all really have a stake in the future of Camphill. And that question of, more connected to one another, who was the one another? I'm guessing most thought of it as the people who are full-time residents in the Camphill place. I'm pretty sure that neighbors includes other Camphills that might be relatively nearby, because certainly some of my interpretation of this data was colored by my visit to Camphill Newton D in May. And when I spoke there, the neighboring Camphill places were invited, and it was quite touching to see Camphillers from these 4 adjacent communities saying, "Oh, we haven't seen you for 2 years. It's so nice to connect what's been happening in your community."
Right. We have a question from Anton, and then,
There's one more.
Yeah, we can alternate.
okay.
So Anton.
So let's go online then. alternate.
No, Anton, we just had Libby online, so now it's Anton.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I might have missed this, so apologies, but at least a clarification. You mentioned when the decisions were being made about protocol in the Camphill communities, you said that most of the communities there was a committee or a group of people that made those decisions. And I'm wondering what their roles were. I'm not entirely au fait with generally, apart from COVID, how decisions are made in Camphill, but I'm wondering, Camphill communities, I'm wondering what roles, because there's obviously lots and lots of questions here, both physical health, mental health, social questions, financial questions, lots and lots of questions, which the protocols affect. And I'm wondering from what angle, what you saw in your research, what angle were they coming to and what criterion were they evaluating when making decisions?
Yeah, and I think it definitely points to the way this kind of survey research could have been supplemented by focus group research, because even when we asked about COVID policies, respondents might reasonably have interpreted that as policies about vaccination, masking, social distancing. And there might, in fact, have been a very different group of people who kind of reflected more about what they would maybe have called strategies of how you keep people in balance as they're adjusting to these policies that are created by another group. Because the basic reality, which varies a lot from Camphill to Camphill, is, as I was suggesting, that there is, one circle of leaders who are largely outward facing, concerned with interpreting the work of the community to the various bodies that provide it with its financial sustenance. And another group of leaders, usually broader, more diffused, maybe multiple small committees that are attending to the dynamics of life internally, which of course is I'm assuming it's a very different reality from other intentional communities, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe every intentional community has that same kind of inner-outer, even if they don't have this particular funding situation.
Right, thank you. We have been joined by Juan.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting. We certainly live many of those phases that you were talking in your presentation here in Newton D. I was wondering if you found in your data if many communities had they started questioning transcendental questions of their communities, because it happened to us that I guess it brought us to sort of catharsis, a bit crisis, and then there was in the middle of the pandemic this really strong question around our community about our model, about our co-worker model, the very traditional one. And we felt like that was very related to our situation through the pandemic, because we created a group after that, and then we discussed the same topics later from the pandemic, and then the responses were much more at ease and less urgent for change. There's still the questions there, but we felt like they were triggered by the pandemic, and I wonder if that happened to our communities.
Yeah, so I didn't quite catch it. Was the basic issue, to what extent did the pandemic provoke questioning about kind of core practices, not just practices in response to the pandemic, but just who are we as a community? Is that the
Yes,
issue?
yes,
Yeah.
because it brought, of course, extra stress, shortage of people, and to like, yeah, to and of course less and less, because it was, as you said, that we were experiencing like what intentional communities experience when they're being formed. So it was very intense.
Yeah.
And so, of course, it brought up these questions of, do we want life sharing? Do we have the co-worker model? Like, yeah, very
Yeah.
fundamental questions. And I wonder if any other community, went
Yeah,
through
you know, this is another issue where focus groups would have given more insight, and I'm really wary of saying anything strong in response, because as I said, my interpretation of the data was colored by my interaction with the particular Camphill where you, Juan, happen to live. And so I don't want to generalize to other Camphills. But I do think this would be a great question for intentional communities as a whole. You know, to what extent did the pandemic throw you back into the intensity of the founding days? And what did that do? Did that make you say, wow, we are recommitted to the ideals that inspired us in the first place? Or did it make you say, whoo, time is way overdue to rewrite that mission statement and become a 21st century community, because we don't know what the heck we're doing? You know, it'd be interesting to see, yeah, which communities went the one way or the other.
Okay, Mitch is going to ask this question, but before that, I would ask everybody to stand up for a minute.
Stand up and
because
stretch.
It is an afternoon, and there's a lunch in there being digested, and it needs a bit of help. So stretch a little bit and breathe a little bit, and send good thoughts down. You guys online, you know, you can do whatever you want, but you might want to stretch a bit as well, and just get some of that air in there, and send a thought down into your stomach to say, you know, digest nicely now. You know, you're having a good time down there, and get those little microbes going. And if it hadn't been so much technology, I would have said to switch places, but we'll have to do that now. That's really hard with you guys online to switch places, but okay, Mitch.
Yeah, I had a couple observations based on my personal experience. During the pandemic, I was hired as a manager at a group home for people with developmental disabilities. I've also worked, you know, I have a history of working with in group homes with people with developmental disabilities. So, but I quickly quit the job as a manager because I realized that they were asking the employees to make a lot of sacrifices and not offering any real reward. They were working for minimum wage. And sometimes there were consequences for what they did on the job, legal and career ending consequences. And to ask people to have that much responsibility for minimum wage, I thought was, you know, was too much. So I quit that job. And I think, you know, Dan, I heard also your interview with Christian Goodwillie on the Communes USA podcast. And when you talked about austerity and inclusion, how these two things came sort of at the same time. I think that cost cutting idea is kind of underlying a lot of that. And so I certainly agree with you in that. And I think I definitely see Camphill as a model to be duplicated throughout the field of people with developmental disabilities. I think, you know, the interest in community and the interest in really supporting everybody that works and lives there, you know, the coworkers and villagers alike, you know, is a very important model that I think the rest of the disability services industry could take a lot of lessons from. So after I quit that job, I actually got a job as a contact tracer for the New York State Contact Tracing Initiative, and then later was promoted to a case investigator before I was laid off in May when the program ended. But I worked, when I was a contract tracer, I worked a lot in Yates County, which has a high Amish population. New York, yeah, New York State. And so, Amish aren't necessarily a communal group, but they, they're in fact very capitalist, and they have their own businesses. They work for wages for each other. However, they are a separatist community and are skeptical about the government and especially about Western medicine. There's a lot of diversity within the Amish community as regards technology. Some of them embrace technology and use it in their businesses and use cars and things, but some of them reject technology and ride horses and buggies and all that still. But when I was a contact tracer for Yates County, one of the things I realized was that contact tracing was really difficult in the Amish community because oftentimes they would have one telephone for like several different households. And so it was difficult to get a hold of people. Also, there's a distrust of governmental authorities and Western medicine. So there was already this sort of initial suspicion when I called. Also, probably the phone doesn't ring too often also in these communities. And then many of them, English is their second language, or some of them maybe don't speak English at all. Instead, they speak Pennsylvania Deutsch, which is like an older form of German that's evolved in its own way in the United States. But I also observed in going to thrift stores and things in the city with my wife, the Amish people there were resistant to masking, especially after the mandate was lifted, when it became optional or recommended. And also they're resistant to vaccinations as well. And I wish I knew a little bit more about total numbers as far as the Amish community, how they fared when it comes to COVID. But I imagine that their separatist practice isolated them a bit more from COVID. Although, like I said, I did call, several Amish households when I was contact tracing. So, but we did receive training on sensitivity to Amish culture as part of the contact tracing initiative. Yeah, I don't know. So like I said, I wish I had more solid data, but those are sort of my anecdotal observations.
Thank you. You've done a nice job of bridging us to the open mic portion of this session, but Bonnie has been waiting online. So we'll let Bonnie do whatever she wanted to do, ask me a question or open mic, and then we'll shift fully into open mic mode.
Right.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone. It was a wonderful opportunity to think about COVID, and I just have to share first that I am been attending very infrequently the last few days from Oregon in the United States because I have COVID right now. So,
oh, goodness.
No, but I'm feeling better than when I had it before. But I guess my question and comment and advice is I'm just so, in my community, I liked, Dan told me recently that we're a Camphill inspired community. We're just a worshiping community, and my husband and I have recently moved to Oregon to do biodynamic farming. And My sense is that many of the people that we are very small worshiping community on Sundays, maybe about 10 or 12 people, but they have continued through COVID, and they were people that we were worshiping with before we moved here. And so certainly we are people who are isolated because of COVID and continuing to be together on Zoom. And I guess I have a sense of urgency, and that I have been just grappling with how to become a co-housing or intentional community in some way. I'm guessing that there are many people, Dan, like our small community and like me, who are so have an urgency because of COVID to become more, to take the next step to become an intentional community or co-housing community. And what is your advice to us? I think COVID has catapulted me to want to live differently in more loving, intimate community with others. What is your advice to us? I want to do it like yesterday. And what is your sense from this COVID? Are there others like me, and how do you advise us?
Yeah, well, I would begin just by, I don't know if you had a chance to go to the COVID #1 session, but one of the presenters there, Cynthia Tina, talked a little bit about her experience as a staff person for the Foundation for Intentional Community, and how, you know, they certainly have been receiving an uptick in the sort of community starter inquiries. You know, wow, COVID taught me I really need community. You know, how do I go about it? So she didn't give a lot of advice in that session, but I am going to guess that that the Foundation for Intentional Community will start putting more sort of explicit answers to that question up on their website and in their programming, because, you know, they're, at least in the United States, they are the front lines of who receives these inquiries. And I'm sure Co-Housing USA and the Global Eco Village Network are also getting the inquiries and trying to figure out how to respond. I suppose, you know, this isn't really advice, but this is like one thing that I would hope newly forming communities would think about in this moment is, how do you find the right balance between what I called intimacy and neighborliness? How do you design your community so that from day one, it is giving people more opportunities for intimacy of the sort that is often lacking in neoliberal society, but also from day one is building those bridges with neighbors, and then is positioned to sometimes, like when a pandemic strikes, lean into the intimacy, and at other times, like maybe when there's a national crisis of social injustice, say in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the US context, that it can really lean into the neighborliness.
Right. Should we, it's actually, the mic has always been open, but I think the subject going into the mic might change slightly,
Right.
which is that we might share our own reflections on the COVID, and also related to other communities, like you said, like the Amish. There are no other Amish here, but there are people coming on. Okay.
Well,
Anne-Kathrin.
I really like this question that you just raised about what is the right balance between intimacy and neighborhood. And I think this is something that really many communities have issues with, and actually many individuals that live in communities have these questions. During my research, I always realized that it's really individualistic. This question to answer it. And I saw a lot of people in the community I wrote my PhD about that said that's only a neighborhood, that's not enough community. And now I'm living in a very small community that are between 15 to 20 adults, and 3 to 8 children are coming now. And there is still some people who say, well, we are eating every day together dinner. We're having dinner every day together. And there's still people who say we are living together, but we are not sharing intimacy. So we are not sharing enough. And I also feel like I've been living in this community of 150 people who were living in own houses and were a good neighborhood. And when I was dancing with them in the circle with Declan, for instance, I felt a lot like this is the community without speaking. And then the community I'm living now, we actually have a shared economy, we have shared apartments, everything basically is shared, but still like there is something missing, this tiny thing. And this came also through COVID. It's like I experienced actually within these big communities, the same polarization as I experienced in the small communities between like vaccination or not vaccination, obeying the statehood rules or not, like they had the same issue. So I think like I'm also questioning this question, how bring up this intimacy, this closeness to each other and stay in a neighborhood together and be also like respecting the space of the others. I think this is maybe one of the biggest questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was Steve Lloyd Moffat who gave a paper at a ICSA or CSA conference a few years ago. Somebody can correct me if I'm mistaking him for someone else in this context, about shared experiences as communal glue, that if you haven't had something big happen to all of you together, it may be hard to feel the full sense of intimacy. And certainly for many communities, COVID may have been that sort of intimacy generating shared experience.
Okay, thanks. Anton? And if anybody wants to say anything, then okay, I got it. Okay. Right,
Yeah,
good.
I'd like to say a few words about my experience.
Yeah.
I live in a full income sharing urban kibbutz of 150 people all living under one roof in very confined spaces. And I start by saying that I have right now both a strong emotional and physical response to this topic. Basically, January 2020, I was asked with one other person to be responsible for health and safety within the kibbutz. So here we are happily creating documents about what do we do when there's an earthquake and what do we do when there's a fire and how we get out of the building. And I was sort of learning what those things meant and how to do those things. And then boom,
Wow.
COVID appears. And it's basically there's 2 of us whose responsibility it is to respond. And basically for about a year and a half, the 2 of us, with a circle of a few other people around us, were responsible for guiding us through the pandemic. After a year and a half, actually passed it on. One of the people that passed it on to was my partner, who here's the hot potato, run with it. And basically, it was an extremely difficult, as I say, it was probably my most difficult year and a half living in community for over 20 years. And basically, our first goal, I guess we set out at the very beginning, our first goal was to delay the virus entering the kibbutz. And once it entered, delaying as quickly as possible its spreading.
Yep.
Those are like our initial goals. Another initial goal was that we would try and stay together as one family, extended family, group, capsule, pod, whatever it was. And that was the idea, that we can try and stay together and meet each other and continue our very intensive communal life, which we had a bit of a wake-up call when the first case appeared, because basically what that meant was we all had to isolate, the whole community. because we'd all met each other. And so we realized not that quickly, but we realized once the first case occurred that we couldn't continue our life as before. And specifically because we are very involved in the outside society, in the outside community. A lot of necessary workers. We did a lot of work helping the wider community. And so there's a lot of movement in and out. So if we would have been able to shut the front door and say, we're going to look after ourselves, maybe our policy could have been different. We had a wide range of opinions and thoughts about what this pandemic meant in terms of it's just like the flu, we can continue with our daily lives, to I am afraid, I have underlying conditions, I don't want to get this virus, and everything in between. And my feeling was also from the very, very beginning that I'd spent 20 years trying to pull down my front door and destroy my front door inside the community and build this shared life. And here was something that had come along and said, you need to put that door back on its hinges. And it was a huge shock and a huge change because for so long, we were working towards for so many years of breaking down those barriers and bringing people together. So my role being separating and creating separations, for a long time, there was a huge dissonance there, and maybe even a feeling of guilt at times. And yeah, we also in the tension between the national regulations and how we would interpret those, because the national regulations weren't referring to a very intensive commune all living in one building. For example, if I want to go and get a cucumber, something very simple and day-to-day, it's not in my small, tiny little family unit. I go to the communal space to get myself a cucumber to make myself a salad. But in the, is that the same household? Is that not the same household? So how do we do those things?
Yeah.
So we literally changed our whole world to try and incorporate also to continue our life of contributing to the surrounding society, but also our communal life changed significantly. There were times when we were dividing up into smaller groups. We were dividing up our spaces, both inside the building and outside of the building. We were signing up for spaces in the early days when we didn't really know what was going on. So we'd have spreadsheets of this time, this group would be there and this group would be there. And it was very managed. And I think I learned through that process that micromanaging is maybe not the best way. And it created a lot of, I think, the questions of what this community is. For a lot of people, there was a question there of privacy. There was a question of who's making the decisions. What is the mandate to make those decisions about my life? Who can tell me that I can't let my kid run around and mix with all the different age groups and all the different families? So there are lots of questions there about individual freedom and decision-making that was going on in a central space. So it was tough. There were a lot of tensions, and there were a lot of different ways of seeing how we should have responded. I think we learned over a period of time how to be less top-down and how to create much more individual decision-making to go on. But even there were differences when you've got communal spaces that everyone can use, and it's up to the individuals that have different ways of seeing things and doing things. You obviously get friction there.
Okay, thank you. We have Alon and then Betsy, and we've got a quarter of an hour left. So any of you guys out there Zooming, if you're thinking of something, then you may have a chance for one more.
Dan, first, I wanted to ask you one question because it was something very interesting in your last slide. They believe that the inner connection will get better, the majority, but the outside connection will. So it's very interesting because in what point, maybe I wasn't in the beginning, so I apologize, but in what point, in what time did you do this survey?
Yes, spring 2022.
Spring?
This past spring, about 3 months ago.
Because it's something special. I'm a kibbutz member.
Yes.
And we made some kind of starting of a research regarding the kibbutz movement and the pandemic. And we know that people, we met it a lot during this conference, that the COVID strengthened in the overall society, the surrounding society, the idea of a community. I mean, more people see the community as an advantage.
Yes.
Because of the COVID and because other processes, but the COVID strengthened this and not the opposite way. So as a kibbutz member, I live in a less intense community that Anton lives. It's more separated. I mean, the doors are closed. As a system, it's not the same room, it's the same space, okay? So the kibbutz movement as a whole, as some kind of understanding that as a community, as an organized community, it passed this COVID they feel as strengthened abilities. I mean, because it's an organized community, even by law, it was easier to this way of life to deal with such a event, and because of that, it's strengthened the self-confidence of the kibbutz and society as a whole. One must remember that we still in an era, in a time that we don't know if you know the renewal kibbutzim, the more cooperative but less equal, less communal community. Jan, if I say it's correctly, I think less communal community, but it's still not it's as an identity of community, even less. Yeah. So we didn't know if that's just a system by a law or it really worked. And because of the pandemic, we saw that it's a success point. Okay, the mutual responsibility, even in less level in the renewal kibbutzim, succeeded. They use it and use it in a positive way. So it strengthened connection between members because we succeeded as in your survey, but it even makes us a self-confidence in a better point toward the surrounding society. And because of that, I try to understand why in your survey, they felt less confidence regarding the surrounding society. As I ask myself, maybe you, maybe others, a question, an answer for this point, because if you as a community succeed, your self-confidence supposed to pick up, comes up, and then it's maybe a better position toward your neighbors, and look, we succeeded, let's as connections, you know. And
yeah, so you're saying that in the kibbutzim, because they managed the pandemic successfully, it strengthened both the internal bonds and the external bonds with neighbors. And if I were to venture a hypothesis about why that didn't happen so much for the Camphill communities I surveyed, it would maybe just have to do with the relative size of the kibbutzim vis-a-vis Israeli society as a whole. So when you succeeded, your neighbors knew about it because every Israeli knows about the kibbutzim.
Yes.
But even in Scotland, even in Aberdeen, Scotland, not everybody knows about Camphill by a long shot. So the only way they build the bridges with the neighbors is when the neighbors can actually go there. And this was a period when the neighbors weren't going there.
Yeah, there is another point of it's okay, 1 minute?
Well,
Jan?
yeah, we need to have time for Betsy as well.
What? Okay.
Okay.
We need the session.
Yeah,
Um,
okay, Betsy.
Thank you. I did want to speak to Bonnie briefly, that I'm part of Co-Housing California and Co-Housing US, cohousing.org is our association. And yes, there have been, first off, Oregon, full of co-housing, including forming groups and including other community efforts that are not Camphill, but are somewhat related about service orientation. So I think if you want to pursue co-housing, there's a lot of opportunities. So just making a pitch, Coho US conference in August in Madison, Wisconsin. There've been a lot of online conversations across communities and seekers, almost certainly multiple Zoom forums and virtual tours, not quite weekly, but at least once or twice a month, someone somewhere, some network is putting that on. So I did want to speak, and there was some surveys, maybe not academically based, of COVID response, but some of that information might be of interest. I wanted to speak to Berkeley Co-Housing where I live. Honestly, the shutdown was a boon. It meant I just stayed home and read books for the first 4 months. We were actually back east, so I wasn't even in my community. But we had a very quick response. It's just 14 households plus 2 associate member households that are right next door. We divided into pods that were sort of like, so that the most older people in the community had a younger buddies. I mean, not necessarily young, but younger, more outgoing buddies who didn't feel as vulnerable going out. What was interesting is that that kind of maybe strengthened certain cliques, if you want, or friendship circles, people who felt closer. So originally we said, well, we'll do it by neighbor. I live in a duplex. My duplex neighbors didn't want to be buddies with Prince and me. They wanted to be buddies with some people they were closer to across the way. So that was just to see that and experience it made me a little sad. I myself became much more politically involved in my city, nationally, and in advocacy and connections to my unhoused neighbors in Berkeley, homeless neighbors. So I didn't give maybe as much personal thought to my neighbors, who all seemed to be pretty well buffeted, but not buffered, sorry, not buffeted. But I will say 2 things. The city I lived in, Berkeley, California, had very few COVID cases or deaths. And like 89% were vaccinated. It's just a highly educated place. But a lot of folks who are poor, became isolated because they couldn't go online. They didn't have good internet access or didn't have a reliable device. But I think in our community, everybody eventually complaining all the while, have learned how to navigate Zoom, even though in some cases we only live 10 feet apart in our own separate. But we had I respect, and there was a quick decision. We shut down our common house for visitors. We agreed that only 1 or 2 or 3 of us would be in there at a time. It's where we do all of our laundry. It's 3 people basically who worked at home and were going crazy working at home, took over parts of the common house for their office. And that they were essentially had to leave about a year ago when we thought things were opening up again. The biggest deprivation was our 3 meals a week. We just were not eating together. So we experimented, and our social committee, or this basically, we had a series of things like, let's meet in groups of 3 in different places around the community and have a conversation with appreciative inquiry or questions, And we did that 2 or 3 times. That was lovely. And then there was discussions there was a period in there where literally, in my experience, all of our brains were just fried. And there was like there was a period when more or less fear would come up and we would do stupid things. Not really bad, just, I don't know if anyone else experienced that, but we wouldn't have collective memory of our last meeting. We wouldn't have collective memory of, well, that's one. And we also had a period last fall when our agenda chair committee, like, wouldn't just decided we had to have several meetings about disaster preparedness. We should talk about the suitcase we should take out in the case of earthquake or fire. So there was just a lot of stress where fire season was coming. Berkeley is not really in a huge way affected, but there was a lot of fear and stress that affected our just ability to handle tasks. But frankly, our community came through, in my mind, with many good strengthened resiliency strategies and appreciation. But I would say it has never been highly involved with the larger city, which is right outside our driveway. Not to say individuals aren't, but and in that sense, a lot of our neighbors around us formed mutual aid networks. And I would say no one in our community needed it or thought about it or even necessarily knew about it. So yeah, I think the city as a whole, in a sense, revealed a greater resilience and openness than did my own community. But I still respect and trust all my members that we did good. We did good to take care of ourselves. And
Okay.
yeah, I could go on and on. Of course, we love our communities. So,
Right.
but thank you for letting me share that.
We really only have a couple
Libby
of
would
minutes
like to-
left. I think there's a last word from somebody.
Yep.
Yep,
Sure.
very quickly.
Just to share very briefly from Camphill, one of the really interesting and potentially unique elements of the Camphill experience during COVID has to do with our diverse relationships to the state. And in a lot of cases, particularly within the United States, I'm not sure if this is the same in other regions, Camphill doesn't fit into any of the state categories. For example, oversight of disability service provision. In some instances, there have been state classifications designed for Camphill, that Camphill is the only entity that fits into that service category. Because of that, while, Dan, as you mentioned, there is a lot of this necessary collaboration and communication and accountability to the state and external authorities, which is a good thing. I think in the overall sphere of, disability service provision, what it meant during the COVID experience was that no single state agency was able to be a direct partner. And so we would often be, in a funny way, searching for someone to be accountable to, because it was a new experience, not only for us, but for the state. And for some communities, that ended up really strengthening their relationships with particular agencies that I think could be a good thing going forward. And for others, it meant that no one really wanted to take responsibility for oversight of these communities. And so there was a lot of support from the state for communities to develop their own health and safety protocols. And I think they then saw in real time the data that you're seeing now, which is, okay, whatever you figured out is working. You are having good outcomes. So keep it up. So it was a really interesting, those relationships developed in interesting ways, and it could be something to explore, yeah, in a future and follow-ups.
Okay, thank you. From Camphill, North America. Thank you, Libby. That was great. We've run out of time, and we have an important appointment with a break coming up. I want to thank everybody who was here. I really want to thank everybody who was online. And thank you, Dan, for initiating this really good discussion and for all the contributions. And I want to thank Klaus for keeping this whole show together technologically. Anne-Kathrin for keeping us on the Zoom. And have a great break. And the next session starts in half an hour.
Thank you all.
Right.
Did you get a response from Glen Craig to the survey? Because you had one from I don't know, so that was from the north, south.